Okay, so today I want to talk to you about the Dark Age of Greece and also the Archaic Age, and I've given you the dates here. Now, we talked about this the other day in class, but just to go over it really quickly again. So starting around 1200, you get a general collapse of some of the civilizations around the Mediterranean. So we talked about the Hittites, we talked about the Egyptians, and of course we talked about the Mycenaean Greeks. So I had mentioned that economies are starting to collapse. We can look at luxury goods like marble bathtubs and things like that. You don't see these being made or used during this period, and it's because people are having other issues like trying to survive. So you can look at the archaeological record in terms of cultivation, and you can see that this is dropping as well. Two of the last things I thought were the most interesting. So decoration on pottery was reduced. So what this is really telling you is that people really don't have time to sit down and paint a beautiful pot. They're having other issues like their city-states collapsing and having to move somewhere else. And of course we talked about how Linear B, the writing of the Mycenaean Greeks, was forgotten. So you do see some changes during this, this collapse. So by the 11th century we start to see the use of iron, and that's partly because if you remember bronze, so tin plus copper is bronze. When the Mycenaean Greeks started to fall, their civilization started to fall, you see trade breaking down. So you don't see tin very much coming into ancient Greece, and so the Greeks had to rely on what they had, and it just so happens that they had iron deposits. And iron is a much harder metal, so you see iron start to be used during this period. Around 1050 or so, you start to find pottery being decorated again. And this is something called, the earliest part is called the Protogeometric Pottery. What that means is early. So proto, let me see if I can get this thing to write. Proto just means early, and then you've got geometric, and that means circles, squares, triangles, and so on. So here's an example of some protogeometric pottery. So what you can see here are these half circles. You've got these solid stripes, you've got some wavy lines, solid lines going around the pot. And so that's considered to be protogeometric, and it's used to date various sites based on these designs. Here's another protogeometric pot. Again, you can see the circles here, the solid lines, not heavily decorated, but it's still a beautiful pot nonetheless. And then you get into the next period for pottery making called geometric pottery. And what you can see here is that now it's heavily decorated with squares and triangles and zigzags. You've got these beautiful handles being made, beautiful spouts, and so on. So some things are starting to recover during the middle of this Dark Age. Excuse me. Now, no big surprise, there are migrations during this period. So imagine living in a city-state and having it collapse. So there's lots of people living in a city, all of a sudden farming goes down, you can't eat. So people don't normally sit down and just die, so they end up moving. So you do see some migrations during this period, and we'll talk about this in just a little bit. We talked about some of the reasons for why the Dark Age occurred. We talked about the sea people and so on. I also mentioned the Dorian invasion, and I mentioned that the Dorians were probably a group of people living in the northern part of Greece, or coming into the northern part of Greece, and then sweeping down through the mainland, and then maybe reaching down to the bottom of the Peloponnese, and maybe they continued on to the island of Crete and into Asia. When you look at the history that was written by later Greeks, so we're talking about Greeks living in the 400s BC, so quite a bit later than this particular period, we find that some of the Greek historians are saying that the Dorians were one of three populations that were made up ancient Greece. So you've got the Dorians, you've got a group of people called the Ionians, and then another group called the Aeolians. And then what I've done here is created a little map showing you where some of the migration probably took place. So you've got the Aeolians up in the northern part of Greece, and they're moving into what is now the northern part of Turkey. You've got the Ionians, and I'll show you some of the text here in just a little bit that talks about this. So it's thought that the Ionians moved to the western part of modern-day Turkey with the help of Athens. So whether it's true or not, that's what the texts say. So we'll just go with this. But the Ionians moved across here. They then populated western Greece in an area called Ionia after them. And then, of course, I mentioned that the Dorians, who might have come sweeping down. The Spartans consider the Dorians to be their ancestors, and then maybe going into Crete, and then maybe going on into the southern part of Turkey. And what I've got here is, this is a book written by Nancy Demand, and I used to have it as a textbook. I'm not using it anymore, but if you happen to have access to Demand's book, it's on page 79 that talks about this. And then what I've got here in the next couple slides are some primary texts or text written in the ancient world that describe some of the movements of the people. So Herodotus, he was considered to be the first historian, and he wrote a book called Histories, or the Inquiries. And in chapter 7 and then part 9a, he talks about people who were living in Greece before. So the Ionians, Aeolians, and the Dorians. And then I've got a bit of long text here, so what you might want to do is just stop the text or stop the video and then read through this. But what it's talking about here, and you can read it in just a little bit. So after the Trojan War, so we talked about that last week, lots of movement was happening. So the return of the Hellenes from Ilium, so what they're talking about is the Greeks coming back from Troy, and this caused many revolutions and factions. And then you've got a description by Thucydides. So Thucydides was an Athenian general who took part in the Peloponnesian War, which I know we haven't talked about yet, but it's a big civil war that took place in Greece in the 400s. So what he's talking about are the Dorians becoming masters of the Peloponnese. So if you remember, the Peloponnese is the southern part of Greece around Sparta. And then as you move down here, and again, you can stop the video and read through this, it's talking about Athens beginning to send out colonies, helping the Ionians, which we just referred to. And then again, Thucydides, you can read this in History of his Peloponnesian War, or History of the Peloponnesian War 1.1. And then just a little bit about more detail on what we know about this migration. So you've got Thucydides, again, writing in his History of the Peloponnesian War, chapter 1.12, talking about this. And I'll just give you a second to read this, so if you want to turn off the video. And what this is really talking about is the Ionians going to Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey, with the help of the Athenians. And then again, this is just the same map that I showed you. So again, so you can place where these texts are talking about. So I just referred to the Ionians, and then Thucydides refers to the Dorians. Okay, in terms of what was going on during the Dark Ages, so not surprisingly, you do get smaller settlements. So you don't get these large city-states because there's not an economy to support that. So during the Dark Ages, most of that fell apart. But you do have some settlements that are starting to grow, but they're just smaller. We have to guess about what's going on in terms of government. So more than likely, there are still kings during this period. So there were kings during the Mycenaean period. There are probably still kings during the Dark Age. And then for some city-states, or for some cities, you get the movement from having early kings to something called an aristocracy. And no big surprise, this word is a Greek word, and it means the best. So aristo. Aristos is singular male, a single male, meaning the best. So, and what an aristocracy is that the power is really being kept by the elite, so these so-called best people. I've already talked about how iron was being used, and that's because the Greeks, their trade was cut off with metals, and they were stuck with what they had, and it was actually probably a good thing that that happened, because again, iron is harder. I talked a little bit about the new writing system when I talked about the Iliad. So what you've got here is really the long story, or actually I'll give you the short story of this long story, is that when the Greeks were out in their migration period, they met up with the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians were living where modern-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon is. And the Phoenicians were writing. So the Greeks, who again forgot how to write linear B, saw this writing from the Phoenicians and they started to use it. So sometime in the 700s BC, probably, you start to see a new alphabet being developed, and ultimately this is the writing system that we have today. So the letters that you're looking at ultimately come down from the Phoenicians to the Greeks, to a group of people called the Etruscans who were living in northern Italy, and then the Romans borrowed this language, and then so on. The chain continues. Now, I'm hoping that you've read the articles that I gave you about things that were happening in the Dark Age. So not everything was bad, according to some scholars. In fact, this might have been a time for some creativity because you don't have this overwhelming government placed on top of you. People might have freedom to do other things. So if you haven't read those articles, be sure to do that. Okay, I do want to talk about one settlement in particular that seems to have survived just fine during the Dark Age, and this is a site called Lefkandi. So it's on the island of Euboea, and so it's about right there. And then what you're looking at here is a drawing of what was part of Lefkandi. So you have this thing called Tumba, and this was a fairly large structure, so 45 meters, probably about 130 feet long, 30 feet wide, and then 15-foot wide door, which is right here. And this structure dates to about 950, so right towards the beginning of the Dark Age. So clearly whatever was going on in other parts of Greece wasn't so much affecting this particular site. And what you've got here is an overview, so imagine that you're looking down on this. So here's that 15-foot door I was telling you about, and then this is the entire structure here. What you've got out here are burial sites, so people wanted to be buried fairly close. And I'm just going to show you a few slides of this area here, which was the burial site of some, as far as we can tell, very important people. So here you've got something called a heroon, and this is a hero's grave. What you're looking at here is a pot, and what was contained in there were some human bones of a male. And then you've got some weapons that were buried just outside of this pot. The other interesting burial is a burial of a woman. Now, she was not cremated, and so you can see her body here. It's unclear, there's some mystery involved, like why she's in the same grave. Was she killed when her husband was killed, or were they husband and wife, king and queen? Not quite sure. But what you're looking at here is she must have had a bit of wealth, because let me go back if I can. Oops, my slides aren't letting me go back. This is a gold plates that were put over her breasts, almost like a gold bra. So these people definitely had some wealth in the middle of the Dark Age. And then there were also some animals that were buried fairly close. So these are horses. And you also have some a bit of wealth being uncovered in this area. So here you've got a statue. Here you've got some jewelry, some gold jewelry that was uncovered. And so what's really interesting here is that, of course, this is right in the Dark Age. So we're not quite sure who these two people were. There's been various research done on them. Maybe he was a warrior, maybe he was a trader, because there's lots of material being found in this. One thing that's really clear, though, is that even during the Dark Age, there is a trading network. And this runs through the islands of the Aegean and then into the Eastern Mediterranean. So material is coming from this area, coming into Euboea. And one thing I also want to point out is that Athens seems to survive during the Dark Age. Now, it wasn't a full-fledged massive city-state, but what was there ultimately becomes the great city-state of Athens. Okay, and just a little bit about the Archaic period. So we've talked a little bit about this, and again, these dates, there should really be a twiddle here, about 800 to about 500 BC. You've got writing making a reappearance, and we've already talked about that. We've got Homer writing, maybe a person named Homer writing the Iliad and the Odyssey, and again, the alphabet is coming from the Phoenicians. You've got the rise of quite a few aristocracies now, so we just talked about the definition of that, the rise of the best. You also have the rise of something called the polis, and I don't know if I can write with this. In fact, I probably can't. That looks terrible. This is something called a city-state. I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't even be writing because that looks terrible. Anyway, the city-state. So we talked about these a little bit earlier. There's a lot of sort of definitions of a polis, and one is that it's, it has sort of a standing, not a standing army, but men that can contribute to the military. And really what's going on here is that the government is being reformed. So it collapses during the Dark Age. During the Archaic Period, you see things starting to come back. And no big surprise, one of the things that's linked to the rise of the polis, of course, is the rise of the population. You also see during this period quite a few areas in Greece are sending out colonists. And I will talk about that in just a bit. So in terms of what we know about the government in this early Archaic Period, they might have had kings at the very beginning, and more than likely they're chosen from the best people, whatever that means. We know in Athens you do have a group of people called the Areopagus, or who met at the Areopagus, and what you've got here is these are advisors, and this word is the Greek word for Ares, so the war god, and then this means hill, pagus, so the hill of Ares. So if you know anything about Ares, and we've talked about him in terms of the Iliad, he's the war god. So more than likely, this is a council advising kings about military matters. As far as we know, over time, you get these people becoming more powerful than the king, and then they just sort of get rid of the king, and you have aristocracies running the city. During this Archaic Period, you've got Athens rising up to be the main city in Greece. We already talked about the polis, run by these councils, or run by the people who are important, and of course the creation of colonies. There's a couple of reasons why you might get colonization during this period, and I'm sure that you could guess these if I didn't have them written down. You have something called external pressure and internal pressure. We can talk about internal first. So imagine you've got your city-state you're living in during the Mycenaean period, and it collapses. You're going to have lots of famine. You're hungry. There's lots of poverty. So there's internal pressure to leave. Get with a bunch of other people that you know or may not know. Get in a boat and hope that you land in some place that's in better condition than where you left. You also may want to leave because in these types of governments, they're very structured. So you've got the king, you've got administrators, then you've got everybody else. And there probably wasn't a lot of leeway in terms of moving upwards in terms of the social hierarchy. So if you're at the bottom, you may want to leave in hopes that you can start someplace new and start more towards the top. You also have something called external pressure, where there's something in the outside world that you want, and it's usually wealth. So there's always stories about how, there's gold on the other side of the hills or other side of the water or so on. So that's what external pressure is. And then I believe this is the last slide. This is a map, again taken from a textbook that I used to use in this course, just showing some of the places where the Greeks end up going to. So you've got mainland Greece here. You've got all these colonies up here. You've got some in North Africa. You've got a ton, and we sort of talked about this in class for a little bit, in Italy. You also have some as far as Spain. And again, this is not all of them. So Greeks ended up sailing all over and landing. And the one interesting thing that happened with these colonists is that normally when you've got colonists, they leave and they sort of become part of the population where they land. So for example, you might expect that when the Greeks landed in Italy, they would pick up some of the local culture. Now, there weren't Romans there during this period, but they might end up becoming Italians. That wasn't the case. So when the Greek colonists left, they stayed Greek and they took Greek culture with them, their language, building structures, dress, and so on. And what I've got, if you look at these slides online, I probably have 30 more slides after this showing you some of the sites in Italy, in North Africa, of some of what the Greeks ended up building. And when you look at these buildings, and we'll do this in class, you can see that they look extremely similar to what the Greeks are going to build, say, in Athens later.